All right, today we're going to finish off Abraham, which, by the way, if we're just covering Abraham's life, we would be here another 6 months if we even wanted to do justice to the life of Abraham. But we're going to quickly go through parts of his life and then move on to Jacob. We're going to skip over Isaac with the exception of one little mention of Isaac's life. In Genesis 19, Lot shows up again. Now remember, Lot has been rescued a couple of times. His wife got turned to salt. He has had no boys, just 2 daughters. And so in Genesis 19, remember what we said about the Bible getting an R rating and at time even, even be stronger than that, an NC-17 rating. So Lot's daughters, realizing that the name is no longer going to be continued, the one daughter gets dad drunk and then has a baby with him. And then she encourages the other sister to do the same. And so both daughters now have children with their dad. And the Bible says that those grew up to be the Moabites and the Ammonites. Again, 2 of Israel's biggest enemies. In Genesis 20, from there Abraham traveled to the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While he lived in Gerar, Abraham said about his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, had Sarah brought to him. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she is a married woman." Now notice, once again, this is the second time that Abraham has done this. He keeps saying, "Oh, I'm so afraid that they're going to kill me because she's so beautiful. So if they kill me, they can have her. So I will say she is my sister." But we learn an R-rated secret. Abraham replied to King Abimelech, "I thought there is absolutely no fear of God in this place. They will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." Now that's also not completely true, which we'll get to in a little bit. Genesis 21. The Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time God had told him. Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, "God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me." The word Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And so every time they came across Isaac, and this is interesting, there was a meme the other day about people who have various sayings done, especially in various Asian languages which are not English, as far as the phonetic alphabet. And so they were making fun of them. And so this guy had a tattoo that said water, and another one had one that said earth. And people were making fun. He said, "Why did you have that tattooed?" He says, "Well, that's what," and then he would show the Japanese figures for it. And people say, "Oh, but the Japanese figures are cool." He says, "Yes, only because you think it's a mystery. But if you show up in Japan, people are going to look at you and say, 'Why did you have water tattooed on your arm? Why did you have earth tattooed on your arm?'" So when Sarah names him Isaac, it's laughter. And this means that every time somebody meets him, they get to say, "Why did you get named Laughter?" Because the name back then meant something. Everything is finally coming together. The promise is being fulfilled. Peace appears to be possible. But if there is anything the Old Testament teaches us, human nature is very predictable. And we are very slow to learn our lessons. And we tend to be a lot or a little self-centered, especially when it comes to getting what we think we deserve. And so, all the way back, God comes to Abraham and says, "Look, Abraham, I know who you are. I know your heart." He says, "I want you to pack up. I want you to follow me. I will tell you when you get where you are going, and I will give you a child, and I'm going to make you have more children than all the stars in the sky and sands on the seashore, and you will inherit this big land, and this is the way it's going to work." But now all of a sudden, we see Abraham, and even at times Sarah, going through very human emotions and reactions to it. Genesis 21. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, drive out this slave with her son, for the son of this slave will not be a co-heir with my son Isaac. Now, if you remember, according to the scriptures, whose idea was it that Abraham have a son with Hagar? And it was hers. But now that she can have her own child, she says, I cannot bear this. I will not allow that child to have even a small share. Everything must belong to my son. Remember, in Jewish thought process, now we're not there yet because we haven't gone through all of the things that Moses, all the laws that was given to Moses and was codified. But nevertheless, the oldest child got almost everything. And so Sarah wants to make sure that when the day comes, that Isaac doesn't only wind up with most or a little bit, because all of a sudden Abraham says, oh, you know what? I'm going to give a large share to Ishmael. But you got to remember the promise of the angel. The angel of the Lord said to Hagar, you must go back to your mistress and submit to her mistreatment. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. Now, this is an interesting paradox. God actually tells the angel to tell Hagar, go back. Go through everything that you have to go through, but know that I will give your son, first of all, a huge nation and a blessing, even though Hagar is not of the people. And it creates a paradox that has to be wrestled through, whether we like it or not. Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am. He replied, then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Now, I want to stop right there and point out, so this is God talking to him. Take your son, your only son. Why do you think he had to say it that way? Because if God told Abraham, hey, Abraham, take your son and sacrifice him, who do you think Abraham might have considered sacrificing? Ishmael. Yeah. So he says, your only son. In other words, the one who is the one I talked to you about. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. Burnt offerings have always been part of cultures. It was simply the way it was. A sacrifice was something, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, but a sacrifice was something that you did to appease the gods. So if you needed rain, you made a sacrifice. If you needed sun, you made a sacrifice. No matter what it is that you needed, you felt like if you gave God something, and it had to be something of great value, something that could not be replaced. And so human sacrifice, unfortunately, became a staple of many religions. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up, saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Now, the next few years are about Isaac growing up and Abraham becoming wealthier and the nations around him drawing lines in the sand, and all was going well until God showed up one day and asked something that Abraham thought was impossible. God says, I need you to take your son and sacrifice him. So Abraham goes out. He sees the mountain. It's all becoming very real. But something that we don't learn for a little bit is Abraham did not tell Sarah what he was doing. He told no one what he was doing. He only gives a little bit of a hint to Isaac. And we can only guess. Was it because he really thought God wasn't going to go through with it? Was it because he was sure that Sarah would say no and prevent him from taking the child? Was it because we don't know? And this is one of the things that we often struggle with, because when we don't know something, we start filling in the blanks with our own thoughts, our own cultures, our own beliefs. Now, this is one of the toughest passages in the Bible. Many of the other passages that people struggle with are things that people said and people did, claiming God told them to do this, or that God would bless them. They thought if God, they did it, but there is nothing that shows that God asked or expected it. This is different. A lot of the things in the Old Testament that people say, how could you let this happen? How is it possible that Solomon had 300 wives and 600 concubines? How is it possible that that man sacrificed his daughter in order to win a battle? How is it possible? And we look at those things, and often there is nothing where God says, do this. But this is different. God actually says, go. So it's 1986. I've been assigned to my vicarage church, which is in Los Gatos, California. Silicon Valley. They just invented the 8086 processor. The 80286 was about to come online, and the valley is going through. Apple had invented the 2E, and life was going well. And I get to my vicarage church, and it's Lent, and the pastor says, well, there's 3 pastors and 3 vicars, and there happens to be 6 Wednesdays during Lent. And so here's the way it's going to work. Each one of us is going to memorize one sermon, and we're going to deliver it at the 6 different churches. And so here's how this is going to work. So we said, okay. So I get there, and they say, Mitch, we're giving you this one. And they gave me Abraham sacrificing his son. Now remember, I'm in seminary. I don't know anything, although I think I know everything. And they hand me, and they said, we need you to preach on Abraham sacrificing his son. Now, fortunately, all of my stuff, I was given a computer while on vicarage. All of my sermons were on an actual floppy disk, the kind that bent, and it got bent, and all of those sermons are gone, which I consider a blessing from God. But I would like to go back, and I would have liked to have reread that sermon for one reason only, to find out how much I got wrong. Because much of it, by the way, back then we also didn't have the internet. So the only resources we had were the books we had on our shelves, which as a vicar was minimal because we could only move out so much of our stuff. But this passage, I believe a pastor could spend their entire ministry just studying Abraham, and they can put a tremendous amount of time just on this section of the sacrifice, analyzing it from cultural, from biblical, from all sorts of different ways, and still be struggling with it. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied, the fire and wood are here. Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. Now, most pastors right here stop and they say, see, Abraham was a person of faith. He actually believed that this lamb was going to drop out of the sky. Everything was fine. And that's the way it turns out. And so everything's fine. But did Abraham? Or was he simply trying to calm his son? How much did Abraham believe? How firm was his faith? Because while we want to when we start at the end and know that God provides a sacrifice, that Abraham does not have to sacrifice his son, and we back it up. But if we were Abraham at that moment and our son turned to us and says, where's the sacrifice? What would we have said? What would we have believed? Because there is the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and then there's an awful lot in between. But Isaac simply says, okay. Now, God has only asked for a human sacrifice twice, here in Genesis, which he provides a substitute for, and in the Gospels with his son. Sacrifice is not something that our culture understands unless we realize that when something is happening that's out of our control, and we offer God something important to us, if he will change the predicted outcome, that's no different than a sacrifice. When you're in the hospital, it's your mom, your dad, your grandparents, a child, your wife, your husband, and you're standing there. God, if you will heal them, I will, and then we throw out whatever it is we think that's so important that God will realize that we mean it. And at that moment, we probably believe that we're actually going to do whatever's required or whatever we offer. The question is, when we view it that way, why do we think God wants this sacrifice? Why does God want whatever it is that we think is so difficult, so expensive, or so important? What is it that it's going to, how is it going to change God's mind? What is it about it that is allowing God to say, wow, now I know you're taking it seriously? Because that's kind of where this winds up, but we'll get there in a second. But when we're offering something to God, why are we offering it to them, and for what purpose? The Old Testament sacrifices were a teaching tool, helping people understand what was coming. But today, like I said, because even in Hawaii, there were sacrifices. What do we think, and how do we think about sacrifices? The sacrifice to make a God happy or to keep a God from doing something terrible is one thing. What kind of God can be bribed? What kind of God doesn't have everything they need or want? The Old Testament sacrifices were a credit card. God allowed the people to charge their sins on the goat or the lamb or the ox or the dove. And I want you to remember, not only were there the sacrifices that took place on the altars, but every year there was a goat, and it was called the scapegoat. That's what we call it. And the priest would take all of the sins of the nation, place it on the head of the goat, and then they would send the goat out into the wilderness. Now, it was very simple. If the goat didn't come back, your sins were forgiven. If the goat came back, your sins were not forgiven. So pretty soon, they no longer just released the goat into the wild because that was taking a chance. So they would send the goat out with someone, and that someone would make sure the goat didn't come back. But I want you to think about this. The question is, because this is one of those things, the Lutheran Church actually believes that the body and blood of Jesus is in, with, and under the wafer and the wine of Holy Communion. The question is, in that sacrifice on the altar, in that goat that is taken out into the wilderness, is it just symbolic, or is there something beyond that? With Isaac, was the intended sacrifice symbolic, or was it real? Because if you'll remember, up until that time, Abraham would have moments of faith, moments of doubt, and moments of utter failure. And justice always has to be served. And so is it possible that God is going to make Isaac a sacrifice so that Abraham understands he messed up, and then they have to start over again? Or is this all a teaching tool? Now, like I said, we know it from the backwards, forwards. So all of this is nothing more than us trying to figure out something. Now, in Leviticus 1, 3, and 4, if his gift is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to bring an unblemished male. He must bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting so that he may be accepted by the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. So, substitutionary atonement. There is a tent of meeting. This is the place where people gather for not worship like we have, but their kind of worship. And if someone has sinned, they bring in this goat, and the person puts his hand on the goat's head, and by putting it on the goat's head, transfers his sin to the goat. Then they take the goat, they lay it on the altar, and all the sins are forgiven. 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And this is one of those things where it says, Jesus, who never sinned, God took our sin and laid it on him, and he was sacrificed. 1 John 2:2. He himself is the propitiation, the balance of the account for our sins, not only for ours, but also for those of the whole world. Now the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So Abraham literally ties Isaac up, lays him on the altar, does not light the wood yet because he needs to kill his son, because you have to bleed them out. It's required. Raises the knife. And that's when the angel, by the way, this is the Malach Adonai. This is not just a angel. This is the angel of the Lord, which is Jesus pre-incarnate. He says, stop. Look over there. There's a ram with its horns caught in the thickets. Isaac is released. Abraham and Isaac go over, grab the ram, kill the ram, and the ram becomes the sacrifice. And then the angel says, because I know now that you have complete and total faith and trust. Now we move forward with the blessing. Now God had already made the promise to Abraham. And it almost looks like there was a qualifier here. That God wasn't sure whether Abraham would actually do what needed to be done. But that's a strange way of looking at it, because if the qualifier is for God, and he wasn't sure that Abraham would do it, then God's not God, because God doesn't know what God should know. Or was the qualifier for Abraham, because Abraham needed to know that he would actually go through with it? Because when we ask what is the only way that you can know the level of your faith, God already knows what you're willing to do. So when you make a promise, and this is one of those things, dear God, if you will heal my mom, I will. God already knows whether you would do it or not. He's not interested in the bride because he already has everything he needs. But this is where we have to ask ourselves, do we know what we're capable of? Do we know how far we can push ourselves? Do we know how much we're willing to sacrifice for the sake of something that we say that we need or want? One of my favorite things is when a child is given a gift, and it's a precious gift and they always wanted it, and it's the most important thing that they could ever possibly want, and it's so important to them. And then all of a sudden they tell mom and dad, I think I left it behind at the restaurant. I left it at the playground. And you go, if it was so important, how could you leave it behind? They go, well, it is. It's the most, we have to go get it. We have to. And it's like, there's this concept of what's important, but it's not always important. Then we get a genealogical interruption. So Abraham goes back to Beersheba, has to explain to Sarah what all this was about, has to explain to the people. Everybody's going to have a different interpretation. And so we get this little interruption, which is genealogical, not theological. And dropped into the middle of all this, because it doesn't seem to matter at this point, but it will later on. It says, now after these things, Abraham was told, well, Milcah also has borne sons to your brother Nahor. Uz, his firstborn, his brother Buz, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jedlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel fathered Rebekah. Milcah bore these 8 to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Rumah, also bore Teba, Gaam, Tahash, and Maachah. Now, so we get this little genealogical update. And so word came and said, hey, by the way, your brothers have been busy and their children have been busy. And so here's all the children that are popping out, and just thought we'd, catch up. This is the Christmas card that comes. Now, there were 3 brothers, Haran, the firstborn, who dies at Ur of the Chaldeans and left 2 daughters, Milcah and Iscah, whom Terah takes under his protection and guardianship. Terah, remember, is Abraham's father. Nahor is the middle brother. Abraham is the third. Nahor and Abraham married 2 sisters who were their nieces and half-sisters of their brother Haran, who their father had taken in. So at that time, marriages of that kind were still not subject to any restriction. So the 2 women that the brothers marry are both their nieces and half-sisters. This is why when Abraham said, well, she really is my sister. She's only the sister because his father had taken over the family when his son had died, which was a requirement that's going to come up in Moses, but isn't totally there yet. But right now, there's no restrictions. And so we see this, and again, this is where it gets R-rated again. All right, now we get to the death of Sarah. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. Now, there's this thing called sitting Shiva. Shiva is when someone dies or when somebody is mourning, everyone comes, and when you say you sit, that's what you do. Everybody dresses in dark clothes, or they have sackcloth and ashes, and their job is to be there because they don't want you to do anything crazy. And so they come to be with you, to remind you that you're not alone. So when it says that Abraham is in there and he's mourning, gets up, and he turns, and there's all these people that have gathered around because he is important to them, and he says, look, I'm an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. So he's living on this section. He has all these animals. He has all this going on. But he doesn't own anything. And he says, she has died. I must have a place where I can bury her and come back and continue to know that there is a special place. Now, the Hittites, on the other hand, replied to Abraham, sir, listen to us. You're a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Now, back then, by the way, they would look for natural caves. If there were no natural caves, the slaves would literally dig caves. Now, remember, you dug a cave, you dug it deep enough, and then you would put these little alcoves into the site. So the person died. You would lay them in there on a table made of rock, and you would allow them to decompose. And after all their skin was gone, you would take their bones, you would put it in a box, and the box would go in one of those alcoves in the side of the cave. So the burial site was not just for a single person. This is why when Jesus died, and he says, yeah, Joseph of Arimathea says, you can use my new tomb. It's never been used before. Because Jesus would be in there for a little while, then as soon as his flesh decayed, they would grab his bones, put it in a box, and either put it in an alcove or they would rebury it somewhere else. And it wasn't going to interrupt Joseph of Arimathea's family. So he says, I need a place, and just so you know, I need it because this is the first death, but there will be others. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephon in their hearing, listen to me if you will, I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead. Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between me and you? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So he says, I want a place. They said, you can have any place you want, but we don't want money. He says, no, I have to buy it. It must be mine. Because otherwise, at some point, you could take her out. If I own the property, you can't remove her. And so Ephron says, look, it's worth 400 shekels of silver. Abraham says, no problem. Here's the 400 shekels. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Notice the repetition. It's going to keep saying this over and over again so that everybody knows that he bought that property. It was deeded to him. He owns it. Why is that so important? Because as time went by, it meant that there is always. So here's one of those things. I actually have a cemetery in Virginia near Lynchburg. It's the Gowen Cemetery. I don't know if I went back there, whether they would allow me to get buried there. But here's one of the things I do know. When you have a family cemetery, whether it's a church family, whether it's a community cemetery, you have a place there. And even after your parents are gone and your grandparents are gone and you might leave, this is why we had the funeral yesterday for a woman that hasn't been in this church for 30 years. It's because when she needed to come back, they brought her back home, for lack of a better term, because they knew that we would take care of her. So, long after Abraham and Isaac and whoever comes after him, they need to know that their family, if they have no other place, they have this burial site in Canaan that they can take their family members back to. The burial of Sarah functioned on two levels. On one hand, Abraham had a practical need to find a family grave for Sarah and for himself and for his dependents because he knew that his life was not that much longer. Remember, he's well over 100 now. She died at 127. On the other, his acquisition was the first installment of the eternal possession promised to him and his descendants by God. Now, here's the big question. Did he need to get the land as an advance payment? Or would God have taken care of it for him? Again, something we don't know. But it was important to Abraham to purchase the land. Remember what he told the king of Salem? He said, I will not accept anything from you because I don't want you to ever say that you made me rich. Abraham was a very proud individual, and it shows. And so here he says, no, I know you're willing to let me bury my dead anywhere I want. I want a place I can call my own. I don't care how much it costs. Genesis 24, Abraham was now old and well advanced in years. The Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the chief servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. Now, this is the one that we talked about, Eliezer, who it's mentioned very specifically that he would not be the heir, because as the chief servant, had Abraham died without an heir, and we're talking even before Ishmael, then technically the chief servant would have decided, he would have been the one who decided, and he could have kept everything. And so Eliezer is obviously trusted by Abraham and by the family. So Abraham makes his servant promise under a very specific oath that he will find a wife from a very specific place, the necessity of lineage. And he says, when he says, put your hand under my thigh, this is the place from which life comes. And he says, under threat of death, if you fail, you have to promise me because this is a solemn oath. Now, the covenant of circumcision took place in Genesis 17. God noted that his promises will be kept, and it is not up to the individual to determine when or how. And so here Abraham again is saying, I don't want a wife from the Canaanites. I want you to go back and I want you to find somebody from my own family. This needs to be a line of descendants that I know about. Abraham makes sure that Eliezer understands how serious it is that Isaac has a wife from his own people. So Eliezer goes, and he gets to what we would call the Facebook, the Instagram posts, all the social media places, the mall, whatever your gathering place is. He goes to the well, knowing that everybody from the community, and by the way, as soon as you're old enough, you send your daughters to the well. That's their job, to bring the water back to the house. So he goes to the well. He's hanging out at the well. And this is his prayer. Lord God of my master Abraham, Eliezer prayed, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. I'm standing here at the spring where the daughters of the men of the town are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I say, please lower your water jug so that I may drink, and who responds, drink and I'll water your camels also, let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac. But by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. That's an interesting statement because he's either looking for a woman who is humble, but the other possibility is that he's going to wind up with a servant girl. Because a servant girl who sees someone would say, oh, you would like a drink? Yes, and allow me to water your camels because that's my job as a servant. But Eliezer is saying, Lord, I'm going to trust you. This is like when Judas has to be replaced, and basically they throw dice. All through the scriptures, they were looking for a way to know that it was God, but they put enough chance in it. And see, we look at that and we're like, how much faith do we have in God? So a long time ago, 30-something years, I had my very first call to a church. And I was struggling because I'd grown up in a time when if you had a call to a church, you had to take it seriously and you had to assume that that call might be something, well, quite likely it was something that God is saying, it's time for you to move. And by the way, I've had 24, 25 calls. So over the years, it's not that I got better at it, but I found a different way of viewing them sometimes. But here I was, and I was struggling with it. And so I went to an old pastor who I knew and I trusted, and I said, how do I figure out whether God wants me to go or stay? And this individual, by the way, with a straight face and honest sincerity said, Mitch, write go and write stay, put notes inside 2 envelopes, make sure they are identical in every way, put the envelopes on top of the fridge or another place where you can't see them. And he says, for 2 weeks, go by and every time you get, shuffle the envelopes. And on a day and a time appointed, grab the envelope, pull one down, open it, and do what it says. And I turned to him and I said, I don't have that much faith. Because we always want control over things. And he said, I said, and how would I know that that was God's will? And he says, you don't. But neither are you going to know it's God's will, no matter what your decision is. Because you're not going to get an email, you're not going to get a phone call, you're not going to get something from God that says, I am God, here's my seal and my digital signature, and you're all set. So here Eliezer is saying, okay, God, if I say, please lower your water jug so I can have a drink, and if she says, without prompting, let me water your camels, that's the one. Oh, and if by the way, the part that I left out because it's really long, Abraham said, Eliezer, go get this. And he says, Abraham actually says, by any means possible, bring her back here. Eliezer says, what if she won't come with me? And Abraham says, then you are released from your vow. Before he'd finished speaking, there was Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother, Nahor, coming with a jug on her shoulder. And you know what she says? He says, can I have a drink? She says, yes, and allow me to water your camels. Now, the book of James says, the prayers of a righteous man or a righteous person availeth much. And this is one of those moments all the way back in the book of Genesis where Eliezer, who is a servant, granted the chief servant, his prayer to God was, I was sent here. I want to succeed for the sake of my master because I want to make sure that the lineage goes on, but I don't want to have to be the one who chooses the way. And so I'm going to let you do the choosing, God, because you know who it should be. And so he says, okay. And it all lines up. Genesis 25. Now Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. Dedan's sons were Ashurim, Letushim, and Lemim. But then comes a very important set of words in the midst of this genealogical thing. Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. Now, if we're to take that literally, that he gave everything, it meant all of those children, Ishmael, nobody got anything, only Isaac. And Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines, but while he was still alive, he sent them eastward, away from his son Isaac, to the land of the east. And so he said, look, I'm going to give you enough to get started. I'm going to set you up, but you got to go that way so that Isaac and my family, the one that is the promised, can continue. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. He took his last breath and died at the ripe old age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his people. By the way, that is the actual translation. He died at a ripe old age. His son Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. I highlighted it because it's interesting. Ishmael comes back for the funeral. This is the length of Ishmael's life. 137 years. He took his last breath and died and was gathered to his people. And they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt as you go toward Asher. He lived in opposition to all his brothers. Now, he technically only had one brother, but now we find out that there's all these children of the concubines and the other wife, and as a result, he lived in opposition to everybody. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord heard his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children inside her struggled with each other, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two people will come from you and be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Now, it's interesting because it doesn't say how. When it just says she went to the Lord and he answered her, doesn't exactly tell us how. But he says there's two nations inside you. They're going to struggle with each other, and the older is going to serve the younger. Esau is born first. Jacob comes in a close second because he's actually holding on to Esau's heel. Esau means hairy. Jacob means supplanter, heel grabber, or dirty, sneaky thief. One is a mama's boy and the other is a daddy's golden child. Esau comes out covered in hair. Jacob comes out and is immediately seen when they give him this term of supplanter or heel grabber, and they name them by what they see. When the boys grew up, Esau became an expert hunter and outdoorsman, but Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at home. Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field exhausted. He said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff because I'm exhausted." That's why he's also named Edom. The word Edom means red. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look," said Esau, "I'm about to die, so what good is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to him. Then Jacob gave bread and lentil stew to Esau. He ate, drank, got up, and went away. And so Esau despised his birthright. Now think about this. Have you ever said that? "I'm so hungry I could eat a horse"? In this case, Esau's like, what good is it? I am literally so hungry I could die. So yeah, who cares about the birthright? Now, whether Esau didn't understand what he was doing, whether he didn't care what he was doing, or whether he just assumed that there was no big deal. But back then, a deal was a deal. Genesis 26, when the men of the place asked about Isaac's wife, he said, "She's my sister," for he was afraid to say my wife, thinking the men of the place will kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is a beautiful woman. So this is the thing I told you. We're not going to deal a lot with Isaac. But here in Genesis 26, Isaac is wandering through, runs into somebody, and he says, "Oh, she's just my sister." And just like that happened before with Abraham, of course, they say, "Oh, well, if she's just your sister, then we're going to take her and make her part of our wives group." So we get back to now. We've stolen the birthright. Now we're going to steal the blessing. So Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me twice now. He took my birthright, and look, now he has taken my blessing." Then he asked, "Haven't you saved a blessing for me?" But Isaac answered Esau, "Look, I have made him a master over you, have given him all of his relatives as his servants, and have sustained him with grain and new wine. What then can I do for you, my son?" Esau said to his father, "Do you only have one blessing, my father? Bless me too, my father." And Esau wept loudly. Now, if you don't remember the story, Isaac comes in, dressed basically in a large hairy outfit, made himself smell and look and sound like his brother Esau, and Isaac's eyesight was failing. He was elderly. And he comes in and basically pretends to be Esau and says, "It's time for the blessing." And Isaac gives it to him. And please note, it's interesting. Even though there is no doubt that there was deceit and trickery involved. By the way, Rebekah, of course, is the one who tells Jacob to go do this. Even though there's deceit and trickery, there's no appeal, there's no changing, there's no, this was ill-gotten booty. Okay? And it's an interesting concept that Isaac turns and he says to his son, "I gave it away. I gave it all away. I thought I was giving it to you, but I was giving it to him. What more do I have to give to you?" And then it says, Esau wept loudly. Then his father Isaac answered him, look, your dwelling place will be away from the richness of the land, away from the dew of the sky above. You will live by your sword and you will serve your brother, but when you rebel, you will break his yoke from your neck. It's an interesting statement. When you rebel, you will break his yoke from your neck. Now, most of the time when we think of rebellion, we think about, in other words, I'm going to rebel and I'm going to basically take care of him. To rebel is to do something unexpected. That's exactly what it is. But it's not the thing that a lot of us were thinking. Genesis 27:41, Esau held a grudge against Jacob, really, because of the blessing his father had given him, and Esau determined in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother Jacob. That's interesting. Esau almost makes it sound like, hey, Dad's not going to be around that much longer, and the moment Dad dies, I can kill my brother. So Isaac sends Jacob away to protect him. Esau hears what Isaac says to Jacob and does the opposite in an act of defiance against the family. So Esau brings him in. Isaac brings in Jacob, and he says, look, you need to go away. Your brother has gotten to the inn, and I can't protect you. So I need you to go over to a family member, Uncle Laban, and I need you to go find a wife, and you got to promise me that you're going to take a wife from the family, not from the Canaanites. This is going back to even what Abraham had said. But Esau is listening in. And so as soon as Isaac tells his son, you must go and get a wife from the family, Esau says, well, I'll show Dad. He's already got a family. He's already got a wife. He goes and takes a wife from the Canaanites just to prove who he is. It's in his rebellion, and that's his nature. We'll pick up here next week. Go in peace, serve the Lord in gladness. Have a great week.